Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to this podcast and welcome to this episode. I am super excited to be sharing this conversation with you. It is with my friend and colleague, Erin Tack Shipley. And I wanted to have this conversation with Erin because I have been really inspired by Erin's work in one-on-one spaces. And I know this because I'm one of Erin's clients in the past 6 months or so. I've been working on a regular basis with Erin, and honestly, every single session has been completely blowing me out of the waters. Like, I have been both surprised pleasantly and also humbled by how Erin shows up to sessions. There's so much care, compassion, integrity, and also inspiration that comes through in these sessions. Like, every single one of them has been really magical. So I thought that I would like to have Erin over talking a little bit about what it means to be an astrologer who also is passionate about working with people and walking with people through whatever is coming up with their lives, and perhaps illuminating and helping them organize their sense of their reality using their birth chart. We spoke about the idea of doing care work. We spoke about the idea of being an astrologer in the age of collapse, which Erin defines in the conversation. We also spoke about Mercury, the moon, and Erin's work with the third and the sixth house. So it's really a far-reaching, very Jupiterian, expansive collage of wisdom. And towards the end, we also spoke about Mars and Gemini. So a little bit of context around that is that we recorded this conversation in mid-October, I believe right before Mars ingresses into Gemini. And so it's very interesting for me to listen back to it and to see the ways that it's shown up in my lived experience, because at this point, if you're listening to this by the time it's released, Mars has been in Gemini for a long time now. So that's a really fun part of the conversation, and I think you'll also enjoy it. It's just two astrologers nerding out about astrology. All right, so I would like to introduce you to Erin by way of her bio before we get to the conversation. Erin Tack Shipley is a Liberation Center collapse astrologer supporting folks in staying with the challenge of being in right relationship within and beyond systems of oppression. Working with astrology and attachment fundamentals, Erin helps people reconcile the gap between how they are in the reality of their present conditions and who they perceive themselves to be in their ideal world. Erin lives, works, and tends community on the unceded and occupied lands of the Amah Mutsun, Popeloutchom, Awaswas and Ohlone peoples. All right, this is my conversation with Erin Shipley. Welcome to the podcast, Erin. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Jonathan. It's so good to be here.
I am so excited to have this conversation with you. So just a little background. I'm sure I will be introducing you in the introduction of the podcast, but we have been working together one-on-one for the past 3 months or so. And I've also received readings from you in the past, and honestly, I've just been a fan, and I've just really loved having you hold space for me. And like, a part of me who's also a facilitator is just like absorbing and learning so much from you and the way that you hold space for people. So thank you for, in a way, being an elder for me in that way.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. That means a lot coming from you. It's really an honor. And when I think about it, I did some work probably maybe a month before we started working together, and I was in this like practice of like calling in my dream clients and people that I wanted to work with. And when you came through, I knew. I was like, oh, it worked. And after our first session, I just had this like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I want to be doing. And the conversations that we have are just so nourishing, and I learn so much from you every time as well. And there's a part of me that wakes up in conversation together and in the work that we do together that is both student and teacher, and those roles feel like braided together, like intertwined in a really special way. So thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah. I love hearing that. I want to begin where I usually begin with all of my guests, which is I would love to hear who you feel, sense, or know yourself to be in this present moment.
Thanks for that question. I feel really human today. Just in the sense of being humbled by my like physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual states. And we talked about this a little bit prior to this conversation, and just like settling in, which was so amazing because it was like, oh, I'm just a human. And being human involves great extents of pleasure and also like the depths of aches and pains. And yeah, so I feel humbled and not I feel like on this level plane of belonging to this earth. I'm watching the leaves sort of shiver outside the window in front of me, and I feel really grateful for the land that I'm on, which is the lands of the Amah Mutsun, Popeloutchom, Awaswas and Ohlone peoples. And I got to spend some time out in the garden this morning. There's an outdoor shower where I live, which is really, I should use it more. But the way that I wake up when I clean my physical, energetic body outside is like unbelievable. And then I think the other thing about today, and I'm looking to the left, you can see this at my dogs, who might need to leave this room, or seems to want to anyway, one of them. I think about who I am as like, who do I belong to, or what do I belong to? So in addition to belonging to this land, I belong to these critters in the same ways that they belong to me, like as family, as a pack. My wife and I rent our house from a dear friend of hers who was over helping repair something earlier today. So I'm feeling a sense of belonging with her. This woman who comes and like tends this space, and us as family, we share meals together sometimes. I feel belonging to some like chosen friends and family who are really far away, like 3,000 miles away. And I feel the ache of that distance. And I feel belonging here in this relationship with you because we've had such a wonderful opportunity to create an attachment bond that is like secure and thriving and changing all the time. So yeah, I think that's how I feel today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I think what I really love about what you're sharing is I'm again noticing this thread that I kind of was beginning to notice in your work. As you know, part of my process is that I've been swimming deep in your words and all the work that you have out there. And something that I'm noticing is that there is this through line of what it means to find clarity when it's hard to find clarity and to feel clarity, and also getting clear about our limitations so that we know sort of how to be with that which is hard. And often that has a lot to do with our humanity and our limitations. I'm curious to hear more about your story, however much you feel like sharing, and how you found yourself doing this work as an astrologer, and maybe start with your sun, moon, rising.
Sure. Oh, okay. So my sun is in Pisces. My moon is in Sagittarius. My rising sign is Capricorn, and my Saturn is in Aquarius. And I have a almost exact Jupiter-Saturn opposition. So I have good Jupiturn juice, which is a nod to our friend and colleague, Diana Rose Harper.
Yes.
So I was not a witchy kid in the way that people sometimes think of certain practitioners. Like, I was witchy in ways that I didn't understand. Like, I remember playing in the back. There was this like little back cove of this farmhouse that I spent the first 8 years of my life at, that was like covered in broken bricks, and there were these cracks between the bricks where forget-me-nots would grow. And I remember, like, I just remember hanging out back there and playing with the forget-me-nots and thinking about what they meant. And I remember there was this really big hill behind that house, and then a stone wall with trees growing along the stone wall. It was like really like a pile of boulders that was really long. And then a big field, and then another stone wall, and then a creek. And I used to sneak out of the house and like go play in the back. My parents didn't know that actually until I grew up and told them. But I would lay by the creek and I would imagine worlds. And yeah, I was very like fantastical, and I could see like threads of that as I got older. Like, I was really into science fiction and all kinds of things. I was always making meaning out of something. And I was also doted on as a very well-behaved child, like a very adult child, which in hindsight, I can sort of understand as having grown up faster than is like appropriate for anyone other than a Saturnian, like Saturn rising. But yeah, I wasn't a witchy kid. So I didn't know about tarot. I didn't really have any understanding of astrology. I think I like heard about horoscopes maybe in my teens, like late teens. I was like aware of being a Pisces, but in the same way that you're aware of like the monthly birthstones and all kinds of things that people tap into now. So I was like sort of a late bloomer, but I bloomed really fast. It was, I want to say, the like 2012, 2013, right around the time I was graduating college, and had moved to New York. I started to become aware of astrology. I was sort of in like a early crises, if you will, around what I was going to do with my life. I was like an extremely high achiever. You know, also so typical, like, you know, white at the time, very straight presenting, woman from the suburbs in the country, hard to explain. You know, we were outsiders, but I grew up like middle, upper class, went to college, like did all the things, was like a super high achiever. And I remember I had gone to France because I was a French major in college, which was like useful in lots of ways, but like useless in a capitalist society for the most part. And I had everything I wanted. Like I had a boyfriend, I had a job taking photographs for the French government. I was living in the city of my dreams, and I was like utterly miserable. Like so miserable. And that was when Saturn hit my midheaven. And I see that a lot with people who have Saturn on the midheaven, where they have like the highest achieving moment in their life, but they are realizing that everything that they wanted was like not all it was cracked up to be. So I came back to the States after that, and shortly after that went through Sade Sati, which is a Vedic term for Saturn transiting the moon, which theoretically started when Saturn entered Scorpio, depending on what tradition you follow. But that was when I found astrology. It just like came sort of rushing in, and it came through mostly a girl who I was really into. At that point, I had come out as queer. And she and I like really hit it off, and we would read tarot, and we talked about astrology all the time. And I was making all of these friends who are also into it. And I found myself flooded with community and a language for contextualizing a lot of what seemed like simple and basic childhood experience, which I could then look back on and talk about in a way that it wasn't, and not be like self-deprecating, or, you know, I could be humble without being self-deprecating and confident without being self-righteous, which is a phrase that I got from my best friend, admittedly.
It's a pretty great phrase.
And really, like, all I needed to be able to do that was nuance. And I think the language of astrology and the planets gave me a lot of nuance for talking about things that I had never been able or willing to talk about, because it required vulnerability, and I didn't have an experience growing up where it was safe to talk about most of those things. Like it wasn't safe to talk about being queer. It wasn't safe to talk about, you know, some of the things that were happening in my house growing up. And I think that's true for most kids. You know, I want to be transparent. Like my parents weren't abusive. They're wonderful people. I love them very much. And there were a lot of experiences of just feeling really different. You know, I was one of very few Jewish kids in a very like white Christian agrarian place. There was a lot of like subtle anti-Semitism, and coming into learning about like spirituality through astrology, through tarot, and I was like buying every book that I could find on all of these things, and like spending all of my free time reading about it, helped me connect in a way that I had never connected and probably always wanted. We didn't go to temple except on the holidays. I think that had a lot to do with my mom wanting to protect us from being like too Jewish, or also like both from the sense of her experience having been maybe like too orthodox growing up, and also from the sense of not wanting her kids to experience so much anti-Semitism that was like already there. But because of that, I grew up in a household that was pretty like agnostic atheist. Like we didn't talk about God, we didn't talk about spirit. We had like, we called ourselves cultural Jews. And I loved the traditions, and I loved learning about what the different items on a Seder plate meant on the high holidays. But there was not I never had a connection to spirit. And I spent some time in some communities and spaces that helped me foster that in New York when I found astrology. And it's interesting that like Saturn was transiting the moon and sort of like calcifying or crystallizing pathways to connect to something bigger than me, or bigger than the world that I knew. And when I think about like little Erin playing with the forget-me-nots and the bricks in the backyard, I just think about like how much potential and opportunity there was for like earth-based spirituality. Not just potential and opportunity, but like it was materialized, like it was manifest there. And I wish it had been given a framework to grow. So when I came into astrology, it took me a while to like, it took me a very short time and also a while to like make it professional. It had just, I hit a point after a couple of years where I couldn't really have a conversation with somebody without them asking me for a reading. And all I wanted to do was talk about astrology. And like, there was a turning point where some of my, like I could feel my energy being drained by it because I had hit a level where I couldn't be matched by like an astro enthusiast wasn't matching where I was with my knowledge. And it was happening so often. So I started offering like really low cost readings, and I actually started a business with that girl. And she still is, I guess, a psychotherapist. And had training that I didn't have, which made it easier for me to offer professional readings early on because I could trust that there was somebody holding the space who had training to be aware of how like trauma might come up, or like how to hold somebody in an experience that like you don't expect or isn't ideal in a session. And we didn't work together for very long. We dissolved that like after a few months, but it was enough for me to sort of get my feet on the ground and feel stable holding that kind of space for other people. And I've always been a little bit of a mirror, I think, because I have Mars and Gemini. And at
Your sixth house,
yeah. And I was getting it, but it also rules my midheaven. So this work that I do, like I was getting a lot of readings from other people. I had different kinds of therapy. And over the years, I've been able to see what has worked for me in different contexts, like sometimes even like in a yoga class, in the way that somebody's guiding breath work. And I'll be like, oh, I like that. Like I can figure out a way to incorporate that into what I offer. Or, oh, that feels good, or, oh, that doesn't feel good. I'm not going to replicate that or find my own version of that. And I guess another thread that has sort of followed me is I've always been not always, but like often been involved in like service-oriented professions and teaching-oriented professions. Like the first job that I ever had was a swim instructor. Pisces. And I worked with like a couple of women's rights nonprofits in and out of college, and saw a lot of things from a distance, some of them traumatizing, just like hearing certain stories. And I knew that the experience of the world that I had and the stories that I had come into understanding about myself and my life through astrology weren't the end of it. Like, I knew that my experience, even though I had sort of like shoved down whatever struggles and then revealed them, was so far from the extent of suffering that people experience in the world. And that's not to diminish my experience, but I could tell that I was sheltered and I didn't want to be. And I think I wasn't able to really welcome that understanding until I had a relationship with spirit. Because if I had been able to see the suffering of what was happening around me, or what's happening around all of us, which is really like systemic collapse and the ways that various systems of oppression keep people from accessing the things that they need. If I hadn't first been able to like take care of myself and the ways that I didn't have access, I wouldn't have been able to bring that to other people. So I guess sort of fast forward, I moved to the Bay in 2018 when Uranus entered Taurus. And I was finding myself in relationships with people who were really different from me, who came from wildly different backgrounds, many of them people of color. Not that I didn't have friends of color before, but I don't know that I was like quite as aware as a white person of like what distinctions were there. And in some ways, like, I'm glad that I wasn't, because I might have done a lot of harm before I had the ability to talk about the ability to really understand how systems of oppression work. And I found myself going to like surge meetings, and there's a really great organization in the Bay called White Noise Collective, where I learned a lot from other people who were like deep in activism. And I also really struggled there because there's so much carceral culture in social justice. And in that process, some of those relationships thrived that I had made, and some of them collapsed epically. And I went through like a series of heartbreaks. And I'm so grateful for those experiences because I sought help. And the help that I sought from other astrologers and other people who were doing this work changed the nature of my work. So I joined Business for the People, which I'm actually no longer a member of, but it's run by a woman named Toy Marie Smith, who's just an incredible thinker, mother, thought leader, activist, who does a lot of work around caretaking Black single mothers and visibilizing their struggle, and also is like a business strategist and is like teaching and learning with people, like collaborating in how to have businesses that are anti-capitalist in nature. I also found the work of Carmen Spagnola, who's so many things. She's like witchy and a somatic therapist and a hypnotherapist and sommelier. I think she has her somm license. I'm not sure. She's
That's
definitely a
amazing.
chef. She just released this book, The Spirited Kitchen, which I'm definitely eyeing as like the holidays are approaching as a gift. But I did some work with her and learned a lot from her about attachment. Because I knew that I wanted to use astrology in a way that was useful to the body, and in a way that disrupted or interrupted patterns that we create because we're sort of forced between a rock and a hard place by the systems that we're a part of. And I could go on more, but I'm sure you have questions about collapse and
So much, Erin. And I feel like you just kind of opened up a bunch of different things here. So I'm just going to go all Gemini moon on you, and I'm going to share the things that came up for me. And then you're free to pull on whichever thread you feel like pulling on.
Sounds great.
I love hearing this connection with Saturn because I have known that you're a Cap rising, and that you have the Saturn connection, but I also came into astrology seriously through my Saturn return. And it's interesting to think about Saturn as actually kind of like the evangelist in a way. Like that's kind of a very problematic archetype or problematic figure. But it's interesting to think about how many people are brought into astrology through Saturn. And then even this connection that you're bringing between connection to spirit and collapse of system is very much like Jupiterian, Saturnian connections. And, or at least it is to me. And also this pattern of kind of like undoing, what we've been stuck in, like the grid that we've been stuck in, feels very much like a Saturnian question to me. Or a Saturnian striving.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting in the context of the Saturn-Uranus square that's been sort of active for, almost 2 years now. I guess where I want to go with that is, oh gosh, there's so many areas that I want to go with that. I was talking to a client last week about Saturn as a god of irrigation. Because Saturn is like traditionally an agricultural god and is chthonic, is bound to the earth, and isn't really known for living up in the heavens. Is if we go back to the Mesopotamian god that preceded Saturn, Enki was the antelope of the deep waters, the god that lived in the waters of the deep unconscious. And Enki made the mold for humans. Enki created humans in order to farm the earth to serve the gods, which is like silly, but also we wouldn't exist without Saturn. So like the material possibility, Jupiter becoming reality on this earth. And I think also about the myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld and how she's helped out of the underworld by Father Enki, who sends her the food and water of life. And literally brings her back to life. And so we have Saturn with the scythe, which is the reaper, right? Death. But we also have Saturn as the bearer of the food and water of life. And that speaks to me to the like cyclical nature of the seasons and agriculture. And I think that's part of the reason that I think of Saturn as like a god of irrigation, is Saturn feels labyrinthian to me,
Mm.
as in its placement in the 12th house, being connected to, or it's having its planetary joy in the 12th house, and being connected to this sort of maze-like way the world works, and trying to navigate that, being a mental game that you can't really win. And or maybe you can, I don't know, some people seem to have found their way to the top, but I don't actually think that that's winning, and I don't know that I want to be a part of that. And I think like Jupiter is like generous without a ton of like care or thought. I mean, maybe care, but not a ton of logical thought. Maybe. And Saturn is like generous with its limits. And when I think about some of the issues that we're struggling with connected to collapse, like collapse is the convergence of mass corporate systems that have created dilemmas as opposed to problems. And Carmen Spagnola talks about this in an episode on collapse on the Numinous podcast.
Yes. I'm also going to link that episode, which is such a fabulous episode.
It's so good. Yeah. And I think without Saturn, we would just be experiencing, let me go back. So these convergence of these mass corporate systems, what they are promoting is growth in order to continue to make more money, in order to perceivably thrive, even though who the money is going to is generally people who have more than enough, and there's a addictive quality to that growth. It's insatiable, and I really see it as cancerous. Like a growth that is cancerous will attack the entire body's system, and that's what's happening right now with capitalism.
Yeah.
And like supremacy, white supremacy, and ableism, and all the systems of oppression. There's not really a way around that. And so we as individuals are forced to reckon with our limits, because there's a point at which the growth will turn into death. It will turn into the scythe. But what Saturn, as a god of irrigation, really asks us to do is to redirect resources. It's not that there's too much resources. It's that there's too much going in like a very small number of places, or to a very small number of people relative to the people who are on the earth.
Yeah. Allocation problem rather than supply problem.
Yeah. And if we take that in like a micro sense, a lot of my work as a collapse astrologer is to just create a container or a channel to like irrigate a wound. Whether it's a spiritual wound, a mental wound, an emotional wound, or a physical wound. And usually it's all four. They're interlinked, entangled. And it's really a practice of like figuring out what are the right doors to open and what are the right doors to close. And I mean, this just being in session, where I have moments where I'm like, I'm going to stop you for a minute, or, asking a question in a certain way, or like looking at the chart and being like, oh, what's this about? And where does it go? Like, can we follow the thread through the labyrinth? those are the things that come to mind.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear more about the idea of collapse as it relates to care work for you. Because I've also heard you mentioning care work specifically in your talk for Fresh Voices. And it's been interesting for me thinking about what does it mean to provide care work through something like astrology? Because astrology is interesting in that I think historically, when we look at, for example, written record of astrology, it hasn't, I don't know, there's kind of this sense maybe when looking at, people who write about the history of astrology, that astrology was used in ancient times for the purposes of empires.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I'm very suspicious of that, and I realize that there's a lot that's not written as well, right? That what gets written at that time in history is something that we need to question, because a lot doesn't get written.
There's so much in that question and in that thought expansion. One of the things that I'm also thinking about as like an animist is what agency astrology has, like beyond the agency of the people who have shared it, but like astrology itself has its own agency as a knowing, as a logos.
Yes.
It is, I remember I was having a series of hard conversations in my moment of being radicalized years back. And I was practicing yoga with this woman. She's a white woman. She was raised in the tradition of bhakti yoga. And I was really enjoying her classes and also like really struggling with like learning from a white woman. And I had like gone down this thread of watching some videos of people from South Asia who are from places where yoga was born, being like talking about the pain of seeing other people warp or twist yoga as a tradition. And how often like people say yoga when they really mean asana, and all of these so many different pieces. And so I had asked my teacher after class if she would talk to me for a few minutes, and I was like, how do you deal with this as a white woman who's like seems to be like pretty aware and like in the activist realms? And she said, I don't know. Every day it's hard. But one thing that I have to consider is that yoga has a spirit of its own, and it made its way here to the West for a reason.
Yes.
And it's bigger than just the people. And there are also like people from South Asia who carried it here. And I think about that with astrology as well. Like it had a role in hiding certain scripts or texts for hundreds of years and then having them be uncovered and then waiting until just the right moment for them to be translated so that this new generation is like falling back into Hellenistic and traditional astrology with vigor. And that's so cool to think about astrology itself as having had a hand in that. And I wonder about like, is there a chart for when astrology was like the inception chart for astrology? I'm trying to remember what the original question
I'm just really loving this detour.
Like, off on this tangent.
I guess, the original question, let me trace us back into it. I was thinking about collapse. I was thinking about astrology and care work. So I want to read something. How it's
used.
Yeah, I want to read something that you wrote as well, because I really, really love this quote. You said there's work that just brings in money. Saturn, as god of necessity, knows this work is vital to our well being. There's also work that is filled with so much care, tenderness, and heart that we would do it even if money weren't a factor. This is usually what I call care work. Work that is infused with spirit and magic and meaning making. And often this work goes unseen or undervalued. Much of my work is in helping folks learn to recognize, value, do more, and receive more from their care work. When I think about work that's aligned to care, my heart lifts. My skin shimmers with delight. I long for that labor of love. It's
It's so funny
incredible.
to have my own words read to me. Yeah. I'm thinking a lot about Sylvia Federici and the Commons. And her, she is a feminist activist who's done a lot of work on recognizing and valuing women's labor, specifically domestic labor, and also trying to create communities of care where all of that labor doesn't fall on one person. So like in our individuated system, we all do all of the laundry and all of the cooking and all of the whatever for our own individual households. But in this dream realm, everybody gets a job, and it saves time so that we can allocate more time to the pleasure of spending with our families. And also, like, most of that labor is unpaid and underappreciated. I think it's helpful for me to think about care work as in the context of the moon and the third house. The moon gets its planetary joy in the third house, and the third house is really connected to the commons for me because it is, yes, it's given like siblings and neighbors, and in recent years, communication, which I think is interesting and definitely comes from modern astrology's like conflation of Gemini with the third house. But I do think that the moon and Mercury share a lot of
overlap.
Yeah, in their ability to adapt and shift and change. They share certain qualities, though the moon is very regal, I think, as a luminary. And I think that's actually where I maybe would start, because like I think about the wealth of light, the wealth of the luminaries, and the nobility and the honor that it gets associated with them. And so there's honor in care work, there's honor in community. And for me, I think the best phrase to describe the third house is chosen family. And ideally, like, it's proximal, right? Because the IC is like physically where we are, like where our home is. And the third house is usually either right next to or contains the IC, depending on where it sits in someone's chart, if you're using a whole sign house system. And care work to me is any labor that goes into tending relationships with your chosen family, or with your local community. It involves being of service, and it involves sacrifice, but it also involves, it's like the work of opening yourself to receive, as much as it is the work of like preparing yourself to give.
Yeah.
And it's requires a lot of listening and learning and approaching things in different ways, because everyone in that chosen family is going to be a little bit different. And it's a lot about learning how to love somebody the way that they want to be loved, as opposed to loving somebody the way that you do, or finding some happy medium between the way that you naturally give love and the way that somebody like is naturally able to receive it. And so when I look at my role as a astrological practitioner and consultant who's like trying to build secure attachment with my clients, I'm just trying to get to a point where we are intentionally chosen members of each other's communities, and we can take up many different roles in that way. And it's not like I'm not going to be whoever you need me to be, in the same way that like a client isn't going to be whoever I need them to be. Like I don't love to approach clients from the idea that we need each other. I actually much prefer to approach clients and client work from the idea that we want to be in relationship to one another, and that we have the capacity to help one another in different ways.
Yeah.
And that's really different than being like desperate or needy. And I don't think there's anything wrong with needing things. But the concept behind chosen family or chosen community and the commons is that not all of the work doesn't rely on one person. It's not all on the burden is not an individual's burden to carry. It's a collective. And I don't even want to call it a burden. I want to call it a collective responsibility. To learn how to show up with kindness, how to work out issues, how to be mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually supported with many different resources. And that's why I send resources to clients after every session, because I don't believe that one session with me is going to heal anyone of anything. Like there's work that a client can do on their own. And some people are more receptive to those resources than others. And that's okay too. Some people have like a whole bank of things beyond what I could send or give to them. It's capacity building. Care work is capacity building in relationship. And it's the capacity to be in relationship, and to meet the needs of individuals and relationships by creating access, like pathways of access.
So something that's coming up for me is the idea, or bringing in the idea of the sixth house as well. Because I think a lot of us who do work with astrology or counseling people, doing sessions with people, found ourselves in this really interesting conundrum of wanting to give that care and also being in a society where we still have to survive, right? That perhaps, so I'm going to make this very tangible, that I think a lot of us found ourselves in positions where we are holding space for folks whose trauma may be way more than one session can unravel. And that I think different people come to these readings with different expectations. Some people have an inherent, almost like pessimism of like, what can one session even do? And then others have this really conflated expectation of, oh, this session that is 1 hour is going to help me fix everything. And then I think there's a bunch of people who are in the middle who are trying to figure out what it means to be in relationship with this language, what it means to be in relationship with the cosmos, with each other, and also in a microcosm way, in that client-practitioner relationship, right? So I think what's interesting is that the psychological or like the psychology, mainstream psychology answer to this is just to kind of collapse everything into like a set of rules. But we often don't really see that in astrological work. And so there's a lot of variety, right? And to bring it back to the square between the third house and the sixth house, what I wonder about is how do we do this in a way, or what are some of the things that you were thinking about when I bring up the idea of the limitation of the practitioner, right? Because I think something that I find to be challenging, just speaking personally about the idea of having a more mutable relationship, is that it may open up to this way of potentially folks having expectations that are beyond what we can meet.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm-hmm.
in the context of, you know, people who are all trying to work through their own trauma, it can feel like then abandonment. When the
Mm-hmm.
practitioner is like maybe opening up a door, and then the client is like, okay, let me try to be in that, you know, let me try to
Mm-hmm.
open something up. And then maybe the practitioner is like, but that's beyond my capacity.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting. I'm thinking about Mars and Saturn
Mm-hmm.
as you're talking.
Mm.
And I think this is a 6th house thing, but it's also a 12th house thing. And the squares, then the square between the 3rd and the 6th house become a grand cross between with the 12th and the 9th house,
Mm-hmm.
where the sun and where Saturn and the sun get their joy respectively.
Yes.
And I don't think we can actually help anybody heal trauma if we go beyond what we're able to do. So like Saturn actually does have to kind of come first there and sort of like toe the line of this is what I'm offering.
Yeah.
This is the limit to what I'm able to do. But the beautiful there's 2 things that are coming up for me. One of them is a phrase from Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Pleasure Activism, which is your no makes way for your yes. So once you say what you can't do, you can then go and do what you can do. The other thing and maybe this is like being your honest rising, is that I try to be really clear in my marketing, where I describe what I'm offering to clients, and what I'm able to offer and what I want to offer, so that they know kind of what to expect before they get into session with me. And then I tend to not divert from that, but I think what I bring is actually very unexpected. So it's not that it doesn't meet the expectations, it's just that it's different than what somebody maybe expected. And I could be wrong about that. I have had some clients, I think it's subjective. Some clients come in and they're like, oh, that's exactly what I thought it was and exactly what I needed. You do a great job of talking about your work. And then I have other clients who are like, wow, that's so different than what I expected. And that was great. And I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but I don't really hear from people who don't like my work. So I've had like maybe 2 pieces of negative feedback, maybe 3, all of which I found to be helpful in different ways. And I don't even know if I would call all of them negative. But that being said, Saturn creating limits is healthy. Like setting an unreasonable expectation is like setting somebody up for failure. So even if they are trying to heal that trauma, if we mislead them to think that we can heal their trauma for them and then don't, then we're creating another iteration of abandonment.
Yeah.
But abandonment is the gap between what we need and what we get. That's what Carmen has said. Carmen Spagnola. And I really love that definition because it's actually not a definition that implies blame or fault. The gap is not something that somebody else created. It's possible. Like, I can understand a parent who like completely neglects their child, creates a big gap. But when it's defined as the gap between what we need and what we get, the responsibility doesn't inherently get put on anyone. It's just recognizing that there is a need that isn't being met.
Yes.
But it leaves it open for the need to be met in a variety of ways by a variety of people or other than humans, which is beautiful. Now, the other thing that I am thinking about is something that I talked about in my third house, sixth house lecture. And first of all, I will say, I think about squares as interdependent, as opposed, like, they're tense because they're interdependent. They actually do need each other. So somebody struggling with a health illness needs community. And community also needs to see the struggles in order to meet them. And community needs the ability to say no to like the larger system in order to then practice anarchy, which I think is just like, it's actually just care work. It's not so much like rebellion or rejection of the government as it is a commitment to create the world that you want to live in and live in it as you're creating it. And I remember I was speaking about Mars as Era, the Mesopotamian god, sometimes known as Nergal, sometimes known as Era. And Era reminds me of erratic, and it's from Old French, which means wandering or vagrant. Latin is erraticus, wandering, straying. The word errar in French is the verb for to wander or to err. So we can err on the side of caution, but we can also stray from the norm or stray from what isn't working. And so what I like to do when somebody is coming to me with like a really difficult situation or difficult experience of collapse is actually to stray from that experience or to stray from the narrative that they have. And I don't generally provide questions or answers so much as stories, because I think that myth opens
Very
up a lot.
Pisces Mercury of you.
Yeah. And so I can look at the part of their chart that is maybe reflecting the difficulty that they're having. And then I'll tell the myth about the zodiacal sign that is, or signs that are connected. And then they can tell me what that's making them think of.
Yeah.
And what's never surprising to me anymore, but like always so delightfully satisfying, is how empowered people feel when they hear a story. And when they hear qualities that they thought were negative reflected in positive ways. And Mars is like, I think Mars obviously gets a very bad rap. It's a malefic. It deals with conflict and war, and like conflict is so necessary. Dissenting, saying no to the storm of mass corporate convergences is really important. Like, what would we do without unions? People just wouldn't have rights. And so when I think about the sixth house as like the place where we're initiated into chaos, and I think about chaos magic, and like I'm not enough of a like magician to really I think maybe the magic of chaos as opposed to chaos magic is a better way to put it. But like the opportunity that and the possibilities that are created when rupture happens. Like rupture is also just more information, and it's like the lifting of the veil, or rather the falling of the veil. Like a curtain that comes off of the rod and falls down, and then you just have the clear window and you're vulnerable to the outside. And you also like people can see you, like there's visibility on your struggle.
Yeah.
And also you can see them. Like you can look out the window and see that there's another way, there's something better, or different. And you walk out the door of whatever building you're in, and you're no longer confined by the walls. And you have many streets and pathways to choose from and turn down. And that makes a big difference for people. Usually when people are coming in, like navigating something big that is connected to collapse, they don't even know where to start. So giving somebody multiple places to start is part of the work. And it's really just like straying from whatever narrative somebody's caught up in, or whatever story they've been stuck in.
Yeah, I really love something that you wrote, which is, my job is to find a thread, hand it to the client, and show them all the ways to weave, which I think is just so beautiful and so poetic. And then in another post you wrote, we grasp at wonder and pull it close because rage and anxiety settle when awe enters the room. And when the frustration dissolves, there's more space to see clearly. And I like connecting that to something you wrote about Mercury, because you wrote something to the effect of how Mercury often carries the keys because they have to travel to places that are locked, that are places that are hard to access. And I often think of our role not necessarily as the person doing the healing for the person, but who are offering these like sets of keys. Like, you know, if you like in school, we have these like people who like carry these keys. I don't know what you call them, like janitors, I guess, like carrying
like the
keys.
groundskeeper.
The groundskeeper, yeah. Like carrying all these keys and like walking around. And it's interesting to think about us offering this thread and handing it to the client in order for them to weave.
What's also interesting about that analogy is that the janitor or the groundskeeper takes care of the space. They clean up, they organize things, they sweep, they mop the floors. If something's broken, they fix it.
Yeah.
So it's less about fixing a person and more about helping them like clear and organize, learn how to like maintain energetic hygiene. Sometimes it's tracking. Like I don't really offer that so much in my practice, but I know there are some people, like I think Sam, I forget their last name, Saturn's Gold on Instagram, has been offering like a type of Voxer support, which I think is awesome. Because you get like more consistent support if that's something that you need. And I think about my friend Jen Lemon, who has this really amazing community called The Nest, where like if you're having a particularly hard time, they're like somebody from the community will volunteer to track you, and they'll like text you every X hours or every number of days just to check in and see how you are. There's a lot of different ways to offer care in that sense. It's like, I think that post that I made where I was talking about Mercury as like the keeper of keys, I was talking about keeping vigil. So like lighting a candle, but like watching, like remaining vigilant on behalf of another person so that they can actually come undone a little bit. So if you have somebody else tracking you or looking at your chart in a session, like you can come undone. You don't have to hold it all.
Yeah.
Like somebody else is sort of holding it for you. And once you've come undone and like the dust settles, you can start to sweep things into different piles and have more understanding of where they come from and what they're composed of.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. We're recording this in the middle of a very intense, or potentially going to be very intense, Mars retrograde, or actually Mars just being in Gemini in general for about 7 months. And I know you natally have Mars in Gemini, and I'm curious to hear more about what you're thinking. Like, if folks listening to this, are thinking, what do I need to be thinking about? Like, how can I orient myself in this potentially disorienting moment?
I wrote a newsletter about this a little while ago, and I was talking about astrology and attachment and some of the things that I've learned through attachment theory, which is in the embodied attachment sessions in the Numinous Network that Carmen Spagnola leads. The practitioners will start by guiding you through a series of exercises where you're actually just like scanning the room and like looking for the doors and the windows and noting things that your eyes land on that like settle you, noting things that are maybe disorienting or upsetting, and really just taking stock of the space and what that does for the nervous system initially. And I've started to look at astrological transits that way. So like, what's in Gemini? Like the first thing for me is, well, what is this sign about? What is this space? What are the resources here? And what's in jeopardy? Or what's what is being risked? What resources are sort of on the potential list of like sacrifices or whatever. So I really like to start with the myth of Castor and Pollux, and that myth is really rich. Like I probably don't have time to tell the whole thing, but essentially they were twins, sometimes twins of each other, sometimes twins of their other siblings, Helen and Clytemnestra. And traditionally, Pollux was the son of Zeus, and Castor was actually the son of King Tyndareus, who is mortal. And they were always like, not always, but they were often present in various quests. They saved Helen from her abduction from Theseus, and they helped Jason and the Argonauts retrieve the Golden Fleece. And so they're kind of a part of all of these other stories, which I think is really interesting. And then they have their own story. So like, first of all, I like to think of them as like ride or die friends. Like that's a big, like to each other, but also to others. And then there's a story where there are these two women who are the consorts of their cousins, and they fall in love with them. And the women, not the cousins. And this big family feud ensues, which involves like stealing each other's cattle. And in the end, there's a big fight, and Castor is killed. And Pollux, just before he's killed, Zeus throws down a lightning bolt to protect his son and kills the cousins. And Pollux is like in this moment of like incredible grief over his brother, and Zeus offers him a choice. And the choice is either to remain on Mount Olympus for the rest of eternity with Zeus in his like rightful immortal place, or spend half of his life in the underworld, one day in the underworld and one day on Mount Olympus for the rest of eternity, but with his brother. So he would share his immortality with his brother. And Pollux chooses to share his immortality rather than lose his brother. And so what I think about a lot in regards to this Mars retrograde are the places where we're living between worlds, or the places where we feel like especially caught up in either or narratives, or like a big choice that we have to make.
Yeah.
And remembering that we have the agency to like stay in a situation or leave a situation at any time. Like we can always remake a choice. And Gemini is notorious for changing its mind.
Yeah.
It gets a bad rap for being two-faced, but really, I think it just like receives more information and then moves with the new information.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because we're dealing with Mars, we're dealing with vulnerability. And so questions that I would encourage people to ask is like, where do I feel safe to be vulnerable? And where do I not feel safe to be vulnerable? Where am I vulnerable with myself, or where am I avoiding it? Where am I like existing between worlds? What is the choice that I'm like constantly turning over in my head? And knowing that it's Gemini and air sign that's gonna like go back and forth and like pendulum swing a lot, giving oneself a lot of spaciousness to do so, and also potentially engaging in rituals and practices that allow one to do that often. So the mind can be a really active place in this time, and it can be really hard to calm the mind. So there are a few different things that you can do. You can try to get into the body, which I think is usually a little bit easier when you have a guide. So maybe you want to have like a partner, Gemini, like a prayer partner or a breathwork partner or a trance partner, or not, just an option, an idea. And like breathwork is really good because it's air. So any breathwork that people have that feels really good for them. I can think of a few that I use to calm myself or release like adrenaline or endorphins. There's like heating breaths that you can do. The other thing that I'm thinking about a lot actually is Sabrina Monarch's work, because she offers so many different ways to think about things, and a lot of like remapping or rewiring like stories in our brains. And there's a recent post that she made on Instagram about choice making. And I think she was talking about like Libra and Pisces. So if you're able to link that in the show notes, that would be a good one as well, I think.
Yeah.
In the sense of if you can't come out of the mind, what you can do is you can create a different story in the mind. You can create a different pathway in the mind. So you can literally change your mind as opposed to leaving it. You can stay in it, but do something different within it. And sometimes it's helpful to have like a guided meditation for that. Sometimes it's helpful to journal of like, what would change if blank. I also really like journal prompts that aren't questions. So if I had X, I would, and then like ... and sort of let myself sort of run with that.
Yeah.
But the idea is literally to stray because it's Mars, right? So wandering, straying, roving, like let yourself wander and not need it to be resolved. And the last thing that I would say to people who are experiencing like heightened anxiety, other than like, go see your doctors and herbalists and naturopaths and like get some like literal physical support, is that, again, the interesting thing about the Castor and Pollux myth is that, or myths, is that everything changes, but it's so subtle and it's probably not the way that you think it will. So like they had a role in the Trojan War, but they're never given the like the blame or the fault or the responsibility for that, even though they certainly had a hand in changing direction. I said that was the last thing I was going to say, but it's not.
Go for it.
Castor and Pollux are also associated with St. Elmo's fire, which is this really interesting, like physical reaction to weather, where a ship's mast will get like lit up by like electromagnetic currents in the air. It'll light up blue. And sailors in ancient times saw this as a sign that they were going to get through the storm. And so when you experience a flash of insight, and because it's Mars, I would imagine it's a painful one. It's like it's the cutting through the illusion.
Yeah.
Remember that that's a sign that you're going to make it through the storm, as opposed to a sign that you're going to like get swept up or destroyed by it.
That was beautiful. I really love this imagery of, and the reminder that sometimes what we perceive as like signs of danger is actually a sign that we're going to make it through.
Because it wakes up our life force. And that's kind of what Mars does, right? Like, I've been really interested lately in the difference between anger and rage. I think they're both Martian for sure. But anger is reactive and rage is centered. And we're really able to like hold it down when we have rage, I think, because it's not going anywhere. It's not going to disappear. And the other thing is that anger is defensive and rage is protective. And so if you have, I think because when a planet is retrograde, the qualities of the planet can often be turned inward. I think we're dealing more with rage than with anger when we're in a Mars retrograde. And so remembering that time is like a helper or a resource, because the planet is moving slower, like there is a moment for rage, just like there's a moment for anger. I was on the phone with a friend the other day, and they had posed me this question of like, what space does anger get to take up in this situation, or in this relationship? And it was such a beautiful question because it took away the pressure of having to erase or invalidate anger. Like, it does get to exist. It's important that it's here. And it can be, anger and rage, I think, can both be used wisely. I think anger is more difficult to use wisely because it's so reactive. But rage is clear. It can become blinding if we don't tend to it. But if we tend to it, it's actually very clear, and it's empowering and strengthening.
Wow. Thank you for that. That was so... It actually kind of makes me excited about this Mars in Gemini transit. I would love for you to share a little bit about where people can find your work, Erin, or how people can work with you. It's just been such a blessing personally for me to work with you. So I want everyone to work with you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I want the people to work with me who are right to work with me. And I also really appreciate that blessing. People can find me at ET, like extraterrestrial, but ET Shipley, ship like a boat, LEY.com. And I'm at ET Shipley on all the socials. I am admittedly a little back and forth in my relationship with Instagram and Twitter right now. So the best way to connect with me and know what's happening is to sign up for my newsletter on my website. And I usually send out a booking link to my newsletter at the end of every month to book for the following month. And I currently have 60 and 90-minute natal chart sessions, as well as 3 and 6 month packages of sessions, which is a more sustainably affordable way to work with me long term, if that's something that somebody's wanting. And those relationships are intended to talk about astrology and learn about astrology and also build some secure attachment. Actually, I would say it's a space where we talk about something in someone's life and we work with astrology to help that conversation along. But it's not astro specific. Sometimes I don't even pull up a chart in a session. That's rare, but it's very focused on the individual and the relationship.
As a final question, I'm curious to hear what comes up for you when you hear the words healing the spirit, with regards to any visuals, any images, or any potential challenges and opportunities you see in that word.
I don't think spirit is individual. I think it's collective. And I think we all have a different connection or bond or thread to spirit. And the immediate thing that came to mind was like my ancestors and the healing the line, healing the spirit of the line. And I think that's done in ways that are like seen and unseen. And for me, relationship to spirit, everything's about relationship. So healing to me is not so far from tending or ritualizing. And I think ritual has a really big place in healing for me, like the ritual of taking a tincture regularly, the ritual of lighting a candle or saying a prayer. And I'm thinking about, for whatever reason, training a dog. My dogs are not trained. We don't do that in my house because we believe that they all have their own agency in this world. And I'm thinking about training a dog and saying the word heal. And it usually means like stay with me, like stay at my heels, but like stay with me. That's healing. So like healing the spirit is to stay with spirit and to just try to be there, watch spirit, listen for spirit, ask spirit questions, and know that spirit is carrying connections to so many different parts of the web, the universal web. And so there's a lot of pathways for spirit to heal us as well. And I see that anytime I work with magic in any way. I've been using Asclepius and Son of Apollo series from Sphere and Sundry a lot this last week, which I haven't used in a long time because when I first started working with it, it was too much for me. But what's been interesting about working with Son of Apollo, and I should just mention, like, that particular series is about healing, like medicinal in ways. One of the things that I love about Son of Apollo that I've noticed, I don't sing really. I've like learned to chant, and I've learned a couple songs in my life that I can tune into. And I've been singing every time I use it.
Wow.
And I feel healed by the song, and I feel connected to spirit by the song. And Apollo is known as a very musical deity. So I'm I'm just thinking about like the spirit of the web and how interconnected it all is, and how healing is reciprocal in nature.
Wow, Erin. I don't think I'm supposed to have favorites, but that might be my favorite yet. So far. Answer to that question. I was just like, wow. I have no words. Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing your brilliance to all that you do and for sharing yourself with us.
Thank you, Jonathan. You're a light in this world, and I'm so grateful to know you.
All right, everyone, that is it for my conversation with Erin. Thank you for being here, and I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. I hope something about it was shifting, inspiring for you. And if you resonate with Erin's work, as always, you can sign up for Erin's newsletter in the links below. And yeah, I highly recommend getting a session with Erin. I think she's also launching some exciting new offerings. So her newsletter would definitely be the place where you can keep updated with that. If you have been enjoying this podcast, if you've been enjoying this episode, I would love to receive a review from you. Reviews are super, super helpful. They don't have to be long. They can be 2 sentences, 3 sentences. That is enough. I found that reviews really help people find this podcast. So, if you haven't left a review, I would love to receive that from you. And I look forward to the next time that we get together again. Until then, I hope you take good care of yourselves, and I am sending you so much love. Thank you so much for listening in.